the idea that, well, I'm going to be just a homemaker, so I'm just going to stay home and help with the home chores. And I don't really want a degree because I'm not going to use it. That kind of thinking is still very prominent.
It's just my worst pet peeve. I'm sorry.
But that's why we had you on. There we go.
That's
You got to
right.
get your pet peeve going.
Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling, who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. You can come study Charlotte Mason with me over in the Charlotte Mason Think Tank. Go to afterthoughtsblog.net/think tank to learn more. My co-host today is Mystie Winkler. Mystie is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 1 graduate. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of The Convivial Homeschool, now available on Amazon. Our guest today is the one and only Rebekah Merkle. Rebekah has dabbled in a number of occupations, ranging from running her own clothing label to designing fabrics to becoming a full-time high school humanities teacher, which is fitting because she was a student in one of the founding classical Christian schools in the USA. Most importantly for today's discussion, Rebekah is the author of the book Eve in Exile, which Mystie and I both read and recommend. Have you joined the Scholé Sistership yet? We recently began our newest Sophie Seminar, TechTonic. Together, we are reading our way around the screen time issue. The discussions so far have been fantastic. The goal of the seminar is for all of us to be better equipped to make just judgments about this issue. After all, informed opinions are the only opinions worth having. It's not too late to join us. All you have to do is head on over to scholésisters.com/join, sign up, and then upgrade to the Sophie plan. Today's episode is so great, if I do say so myself. Mystie and I had a nice long chat with Rebekah Merkle about educating daughters and launching daughters. Do you want to value homemaking while still having a well-educated daughter? If so, this conversation is most definitely for you. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. So, Mystie, why don't you go first and show us how it's done?
Yes. Well, my Scholé Everyday is Kristen Lavren's daughter. Again. I can't remember if we've been recording that long. I read it a long time ago, like 6 or 7 years ago. But then our other co-host, Abby, had it, I think last year as her Scholé Everyday. But I'm reading it again because a local book group had it on their list as part of their year. And so I'm reading it for a second time with the book group. And I told the group, it's like, oh yeah, I've read it before. It's like the most emotionally disturbing book I've ever read.
Good sales pitch. I'm totally sold now.
But it's really interesting reading it a second time because I know where the story is going and that she's not going to actually make her life better in the end. I'm seeing things in the beginning, in the setup of her life. We just finished the first book of the 3-book series. And it's just such a story of seeing the consequences of sin, even small sin. And one of the comments that really stood out to me this time was she has this moment where she realizes that her personal sin that she thought was just her life is actually affecting other people's lives. Her sin will ruin other people's lives. I forget who said it, and I didn't look up the quote, but there's a quote about reading that, we should read to get experience of others that have gone before us without going through it. This isn't a true story, but it is true in the sense of it calls evil, evil, and sin, sin. And you can really experience that. She has all kinds of chances and calls to repentance, and she chooses not to. And she sows bitterness and anger in her relationships. And now knowing what's coming, it's like, oh, that's going to bear fruit later. So it's good to root out those sins when they're little.
Isn't that the truth?
So how about you, Becca?
Well, I just finished a book called Down the Garden Path, which I've read a number of times, by Beverly Nichols. And he was a sort of early 20th century writer, kind of a flamboyant Englishman who just did these interesting kind of just writing about gardening. And he's a delightful author. I think he was a mess of a human, but he is, anyway, that's just a fun reread. And I'm currently in the middle of a book called Sissinghurst, which is super interesting. It's again, an early 20th century British poet, Vita Sackville West, who was also a mess of a human, but she was a poet, garden author, prolific in many ways. And she built this garden that's one of the most sort of well-known gardens in England now, at this old ruined castle. And it's just a very famous and influential garden. And interestingly, her grandson is married to a woman, Sarah Raven, who has lived at Sissinghurst and is herself a very well-known gardener in England. So it's this kind of combination of telling the story of Sissinghurst and some of Vita Sackville West's garden writing, combined with Sarah Raven being the one who is curating it. Anyway, it's just a fascinating read as well. So there's sort of a theme there going, I guess, of early 20th century messes of humans who made gardens.
That's a very specific category.
Right? Yeah, it's kind of a niche genre that I have found myself in, but
well, mine. Well, I'm not trying to be controversial over and over again. I was telling
Yes,
Misty,
she is.
I wasn't. Okay, we have this thing called the 5x5 challenge that we do every year. We choose 5 categories, and then we choose 5 books in each of those categories, and we try to read them in 1 year. And so I think what happened was Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Dr. Fauci, came out around the time I was making my category. At least this is how I remember it. I didn't put his book on the list. Instead, I decided to read about that kind of issue. So now we're getting hate mail on the podcast.
Not the first time.
But I've really upped my game. So anyway, so I'm reading Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, which is about medical experimentation on Black Americans, which is interesting. But yeah. I'm only in the very, very beginning. And I feel like I keep zooming back around to these same different issues of people doing things for greed instead of for the good of others. I mean, just I'm realizing the complaint about things like big pharma or big medicine are actually very old and not something new. So I feel like it's been very instructive in that. But I'm on the section about slave doctors and about how lucrative slave medicine was. And what is fascinating to me, actually, because this was written before the whole fiasco of the last few years. So the traditional Western view of the doctor-patient relationship is that there is no person between that. It's, medicine by consent, and it's the relationship is they call it the doctor-patient dyad in this book. Well, when someone is owned by another person, it's an owner-doctor dyad, and the patient has no recourse. So there's nothing they can do when they are not satisfied with their care. They don't get to have informed consent. They don't get to make their own decisions. And there's nothing they can do if they're injured or even die. And I don't know, I'm seeing these interesting parallels between that and really what we're seeing is the fruits of like a semi-socialized medicine, where there are these third parties that are kind of intruding. And it's not exactly the same as being owned, but you start to wonder at what point you're technically owned if you don't get to have this exclusive doctor-patient relationship. Anyway, it's a fascinating read. It's hard to read, which is why I put it off until October because it's a bit much at times. It's very, I don't know, it's discouraging. But anyway, I feel like I'm seeing these patterns that are not just like, we want to say, oh, this just happened to this group over here. But I think I'm seeing this larger pattern of this is how sin works itself out over time on a large level if we don't nip things in the bud. So Anyway, that's my uplifting book review for this week. I didn't even mention certain things, Misty, that get me into trouble. So we'll be good.
Hi, Abby here to tell you about the Sistership. Do you ever feel frustrated with social media? Scroll looking for good ideas, like beautiful pictures, and follow accounts that portray an ideal? But when you walk away, you feel distracted, dissatisfied, and disappointed with the time that you've wasted? Because what you're really looking for is connection and having real conversations about what matters most to homeschooling moms, about educational philosophy and principles, not just superficial and shallow tips and tricks. Well, the Sistership is a place for moms to dig deep into principles and practices, not to waste time. We want to help you connect and find community, not just online, but in real life. The Sistership is private, ad-free, drama-free, and free to join. Find your like-minded sisters today. Go to scholésisters.com/sistership.
Misty, I'm actually going to have you do the intro because I hadn't heard of this book until you told me to read it, Even Exile, by our guest today.
Well, I read Even Exile when it came out, and I've seen there's a documentary also that's pretty new and pretty awesome. And when Brandy mentioned she wanted to do an episode on higher education, or at least post-high school education for daughters, I said, well, there is one guest. But my favorite part about Even Exile was actually how it goes over the history of feminism. Because I think as conservative homeschooling families, it's really easy to fall into well, if it's feminist, we're not feminist. Right. And so, we just kind of react rather than reason and figure out what we actually believe and what we should actually do based on scripture. But if something presents itself as feminist, we just say, well, we're not that. And my favorite point in Even Exile is actually where you share how a lot of the Christian or conservative response to today's feminism or modern feminism is to go back to the 50s version of feminism, which is actually the root problem, not the solution.
Right.
So I think we just need to work out a revision of education, for all persons, but boys and girls are actually different. And more than ever now, we need to work with that and emphasize that because it's being diminished and contradicted by the culture. So we really need to lean into differences, but in a healthy way and not a reactionary way. As we look at educating daughters and raising them up, I know one kind of historic trouble spot for homeschoolers. I'm a second generation homeschooler. So I was homeschooled in the 80s and 90s. And there was at that time a lot of talk about, well, it's not as important that girls read or whatever. They should just stay home. They should just help their mom with all the small passel of children. I don't know what younger daughters are supposed to do.
Seriously.
But, and now it seems like that's kind of faded into the background, but we just kind of assume the cultural kind of androgyny of, well, education is just education. And there isn't, boys and girls, there is no difference in the education that they need at all. So do boys and girls need different education, Becca?
I feel like to answer that, it seems like we have to go back sort of one more step to ask, what is education in the first place? Because I do think, my husband is the president of New St. Andrews College, which is a small Christian liberal arts college. And so one of the things that is distinctive about it is it doesn't offer specific degrees. It's a liberal arts degree.
Right.
So it's not like you could get a degree in computer engineering or, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really interesting if you look at the history of higher ed in America. There was this with the land grant universities being sort of brought in kind of 19th century, you have this exploding young country, like massive amounts of land that has to be settled, right? And so it's this young booming country, and they start setting up these universities, the sort of beginning of the land grant state universities. And the purpose of them at the time was to offer degrees in what they called the useful arts, as opposed to the liberal arts, which was the older method of education. And this is where we started looking at education as merely a series of sort of like being certified for a particular job, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is the beginning of the domestic sciences degrees, because it was sort of like, in order to do this job, you have to perform these series of tasks, and you have to be certified in these places, and then we'll give you this piece of paper that says, ta-da, now you are ready to go out and get this job. So that's when we started naming degrees after jobs, instead of the older way of looking at it, which was sort of habits of the mind, right? Like the older method of education was to form the person and to teach them how to think, rather than to certify them to become hireable in this one narrow field. And so now, you pick your degree based off the job that you think you're going to get. And some of them are more of a joke than others. Like now you can get a degree in like being an esports coach, which is like, it's a real degree. And so it's sort of like, as soon as any place in the job market opens up, the schools all hustle around and say, no, to get that job, you have to go through our program and pay us, and then we'll certify you with this little stamp of approval. And I think that if we think of education that way, I think we've really cheapened it, honestly. Mm-hmm. And I do think I would want to sort of qualify this. I would not want to give my daughters the identical education as my sons if what I'm talking about is a career path and that's it. But if we're talking about forming a worshiper of God, forming a soul who understands God's creation and their place in it and how they should proceed, absolutely, your daughters need the same education as your sons. All to say, I think I would want to qualify it and make sure I was explaining what I meant by it. But yeah, I totally think your daughters should be educated like your sons should. But I also think I probably mean something a little bit more qualified. I wouldn't want to just launch my daughters onto a career path in the same way I would want to launch my sons, if that makes sense.
Right. Yes. Well, I was actually hoping you would get at that, because I have 2 teenage daughters at home who are not yet launched, not to turn this into like a personal counseling session. Yeah. But can we? No. So I do have a question about, so I feel like at my house, I have, like one who will likely go to college and one who likely will not. And I'm wondering about, okay, so you live near a college, but for those of us who do not live near at least a desirable college,
right?
What issues do you think parents, because we have a lot of parents on this stage listening to us, a lot of moms, that we all need to be aware of regarding sending daughters away to college? I mean, what are the considerations beyond just choosing a good school that is near a good church? I feel like that covers a lot of bases, but I still have this, I don't know. I felt very much like I knew what to do with my boys. I'm not so sure about my girls in this environment.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, honestly, I don't think that college necessarily has to be for everyone. I do think America has kind of turned it into that. For instance, you want to be an esports coach. I don't think you need to go to college for that.
So true.
So I do think there's a lot of kind of diploma inflation sort of going on.
Yeah.
I feel like if you have somebody who knows what they want to do, I think oftentimes the best way to learn that industry or that field is to get a job in that field, rather than go through this kind of like sometimes unnecessary and expensive degree. So there's a lot of kids who really should just go straight into whatever it is they're going to do. And then there are other, fields that just, you can't do that. You really need, you really need higher ed for that. I think people don't take seriously enough how formative those 4 years are. And I think this is true of sons as well as daughters. I think a lot of times people give their kids a K-12 Christian education. It's like, we gave them the worldview, we gave them all this stuff, it's like we have poured the concrete, it's set. And now they just need to go off and get those 4 years where it's like, okay, now you get certified for particular job fields, whatever. But I think honestly, that's a little bit naive, because if you look at just the stats in the first place, it's terrifying the number of kids who go off to college and lose their faith by the end of their freshman year. And it depends on what statistics you're looking at. But, like the Southern Baptists, I think, have done a study of just Southern Baptist kids where it's like they went to church all the way growing up. And by the end of their freshman year of college, I think it's in the 80 to 90% have lost their faith by the end of their freshman year, which means that like you would have had a better chance of survival had you been in the first wave on Normandy Beach than just going off to your state college, And so I think that there's a lot of people who don't take that risk seriously enough. And honestly, if you think back about the age from 18 to 22 in your own life, like, were those the years where nothing of significance happened? Didn't really make a difference one way or the other. I mean, it's like, oh, they were. I mean, think about, the age 18 to 22 in your own life and in the life of everyone as opposed to the years from, say, like 33 to 37. Which one is a more significant and impactful 4 years? And I just think, that's the moment where kids are deciding who they are, what they believe, what they're going to be. They're making decisions about their career. Oftentimes it's hugely important in their family. They meet somebody or they discover what kind of family they want to have in the future. It's where they're owning their faith personally, or they're walking away from the faith. The sins people get into in 18 to 22 can haunt them for a long time, can be really life altering. Those are, they're really important years. And I think that by all means, K to 12 matters a lot. But I think that those next 4 years are still really significant. And I don't think we should dismiss them as like, oh, they've got the worldview now, and now we'll just, get the certificate. I think those are important years for both sons and daughters. So I would just be taking those sorts of things into account, not just where's a good school that has great buildings and offers a degree and,
Right. Mm-hmm. I wonder why. I'm just thinking we tend to take so seriously that K-12. Why are we willing to compromise when they turn 18?
I feel like there's this, it's almost this unquestioned expectation that this is a rite of passage. This is the American rite of passage. And in order for it to be real, it has to have a football team, because if it doesn't have a football team, what even is it? But you know what I mean? Like we have this expectation that we don't question. It's like, it has to have dorms, has to have a football team, has to have this, because it's like the great American rite of passage. And I do think sometimes parents too they're remembering the college they went through, which is not the same. I mean, the landscape has really changed. And it's not going to be the same for your kids as it was for you in the 90s or the 80s or, whatever it was that you went through. So I don't know. I think that there's just a lot of things that we're not ready to think outside the box. It's never occurred to us to think outside the box. It's just kind of, this is just what you do. You go off to college and you have that experience.
So for higher education on the college level, the liberal arts degree can and should be the same for boys and girls, because it's just, forming, human flourishing, learning to think, that whole thing. But then is there a difference in if they're not college bound? I think we all would think, well, I should push my son out.
Can we back up a little bit, Misty, and first say, like, what's the difference if you have a daughter that, like, let's say she wants to be a nurse or something that really does require this, then other than finding a local university where you can stay home and do this, like, what are the other ways of thinking about this and protecting them if they have to go to a school that has more of the job training approach?
Yeah, I feel like you would really have to be really honest about the risks. And then just like anything else, I mean, if you were going to send your kid off on some dangerous backpacking trip or something, you would want to know that they were really prepared and you'd thought through the contingencies and they had what they needed. And, honestly, I mean, every situation is going to be totally different because your daughter's going to be different than somebody else's daughter. And the program she's picked will be different than, the other school offers. But I would just want to take it seriously, take the risk seriously, and then go from there. Just think like, what can we do that will protect her, honestly.
Mm-hmm. I know one of the things my parents said, I went to University of Idaho, and my parents said, well, you're not going alone. Like, if you're going to go, you have to have a roommate we know from here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that was great. We're still friends, just long time friend. We were just kind of sort of friends, but we got married then the same time and have had kids together. And it was like an anchor of home and familiarity, and someone who's like, that's not what you're about, who just is that touch point.
And I think too, like, some of these things are just transferable concepts because they are just how a Christian ought to be wherever they find themselves, in a new job environment or a new, community or whatever. But one of the things my grandpa always said is sort of a matter of, habit. So whenever you find yourself in a new situation, surrounded by new people, you fly the flag that you're a Christian right out of the blocks, because for one thing, it'll be a lot more awkward to bring up later. So you should just get that out there right at the front end, like you're a Christian, because honestly, even if you're surrounded by non-Christians, they will hold you to it. Because they will be like, what are you doing that for? I thought you were a Christian. Or it's a way of keeping yourself accountable, because if you feel like nobody knows I'm a Christian, I'm kind of, here I am undercover, there's all manner of things that we can let ourselves get away with.
Yeah.
Whereas even if you're the only Christian in the room, all the people around you, if they know, they'll ask about it or whatever. So I would just say lots of things like that. Like, tell people you're a Christian, be willing to stand up for your faith. And that is another thing. It's like, is your son ready to do that? Are they ready to go and actually take a lot of heat for their faith? Because I think increasingly that is exactly what is going to happen when they go off to school.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Misty. Now you can ask your question.
Now I have to remember what it was.
That was very satisfying. I think were you talking about not going to college? Was that what you were talking about?
Yeah. So if we aren't going to send them to a program or send them to a liberal arts college, should we be encouraging them to move out, to, have independence from us in what kind of ways? Or
if they're not going to go to college, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Again, I really feel like that would be just different for every situation, like where you really have to think about your own daughter and what does she need and what is she good at? What are her gifts? What are her desires? What are her opportunities? I think that at a certain point, absolutely. But, like, let's say she's not married and I don't think she should have to live with her parents till she dies. But at the same time, like our daughters have stayed at home longer than our son, he moved out, he stayed at home beginning of college, then moved out and got an apartment with friends, and our daughters stayed at home longer. But our one daughter is over in London at the moment doing cordon bleu cooking school for 3 months.
Wow.
So she's just off having an adventure, but it's one that's going to be a really interesting kind of life skills kind of adventure too. Like, it's this really intense program that she's doing, which is a total kick. And I'm loving hearing about it. And I'm like, oh my word, I'm going to have to up my game here. But anyway, I don't think it should be a one size fits all. Like, girls should never move out or girls should always move out. It's just a lot of wisdom as a parent and understanding your daughter and understanding what's going to help her thrive and what's going to, push her closer to Christ.
I love that idea of having, that she's off having an adventure and learning a new skill, because, the idea that, well, I'm going to be just a homemaker, so I'm just going to stay home and help with the home chores, and I don't really want a degree because I'm not going to use it. That kind of thinking is still very prominent.
It's just my worst pet peeve. I'm sorry.
But that's why we had you on. There we go.
That's
I got to
right.
get your pet peeve going.
I think the thing is it's like, okay, so you want to be just a homemaker. You clearly have not a very high opinion of what being a homemaker is. You're just a glorified kind of like babysitter or something.
Laundress.
I mean, it's just sort of like, it's basically the thing that gets me about that attitude is that it has completely swallowed the feminist lie without noticing that it has. And so basically you have this kind of, basically second wave feminism is kind of where this really took shape. But the idea that being a homemaker is this demeaning, boring, ridiculous job that doesn't matter, is not important. And that's so ubiquitous now. I mean, that's just what everybody thinks about homemakers. And so you have that lie takes root. And then the feminists react to it by saying, yeah, so that's why we're going to go off and get jobs. And then for whatever weird reason, the conservatives are like, yeah, that's what we like. Boring, meaningless jobs. I mean, and so you get this kind of like weird underachieving, no concept of the significance and beauty of this calling. And the idea that it takes no particular preparation or effort. And it's just, kind of what happens. And so if you want to embrace homemaking, you should have some appreciation for the significance of this calling. And if you do that, then you realize it's not just something that any old, underachiever can excel at. So, yeah, I just feel like it's this funny place where like feminism has made its way into conservative circles without them even noticing that that's what they're doing, because they've bought the lie, but then they react to it emotionally differently than the feminists do.
Okay, so let's say we have a daughter that is not going to college, doesn't have marriage prospects yet, that kind of thing, and is interested in working after high school. So in that context, how do we continue to encourage homemaking and becoming excellent at these different things when they're basically, I don't want to say they're jumping into a career, because usually the jobs they get at that point are not actually career type jobs. Right. But I mean, like, how do we keep them from becoming that consumed with working woman in that context?
Well, I wonder about you think about let's say somebody wants to eventually become a lawyer, right? Okay. They're not a lawyer yet, but they want to. Well, they're not going to say, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to, get a job as a dental assistant. And then if somebody asks me to represent them in court, then I will become a lawyer. It's like, if you know where you're heading, you prepare for it, right? You get on a particular road that is going to propel you more towards that thing, so that when you arrive there, you'll be good at it, right? You don't just think, right, after I become a lawyer, then I'll read some books about law. You do that in preparation. And so I would say, if that's what God willing, that's what you want to end up as, well, then don't just go the opposite direction, right? Try and figure out how you can become excellent at the things that you want to be excellent at that time. Like, should God, bring that about and answer your prayers or whatever, and you find yourself as a homemaker, you don't want to then look around and think, right, okay, so what do I need to learn how to do?
Mm-hmm.
So I would just think, like, if that's what you want your daughter to end up in, prepare her for that, make sure she's on that path. And that's the funny thing about my daughter being at Cordon Bleu right now. It's like all the chefs there are all, worked in Michelin starred restaurants and everything. And it's this very sort of intense program, and all the people there want to become chefs and go into restaurant work. And she totally does not at all. Like, she's not even sort of interested in that. And so she said it's the funniest conversation that she has all the time. She's like, well, I just really wanted to learn how to do this because I feel like it's kind of a life skill. And so it has nothing to do with her wanting to go on and become a chef. It's like, she graduated from New St. Andrews in May, and she wanted to do something that's like, what, this is something I'm going to be doing the rest of my life. So I'm going to just try to become excellent at it. Mm. Anyway, I just think that path can look completely different for every girl. I really think it's bad to get the idea that there's this one sort of cookie cutter thing. And I think that's one of the things that is so kind of annoying about that low view of homemaking is it's just this one look. And I remember in the 90s, it was like you wore a jumper, you had a crock pot, you drove the van, and that's what it looks like. That's what homemaking looks like. Whereas this is a big world, and God has given us so many things to work with and so many places to become excellent. And it's like, we're not going to run out of ideas. You've got to just throw yourself at things and dive in and, roll up your sleeves and try to become good at what God has put in front of you. And I just think that there's so much scope for a single woman to do that as much as for a married woman, sometimes more, because, when you're single, you actually have the time and the ability to try to become excellent at some of these things. Whereas, once you're married and you're in the trenches with little babies or whatever, it can just be, harder to do that. So I would just say, make the most of your opportunities and the time you have, and try to think of it in terms of the way you would if you wanted to become an electrical engineer or a lawyer or something. You would get on the path and you would try and get good at the things that would help you out. So
and so often we do see women and moms who, they get 5-10 years into being a wife and mother and look up and wait, this is hard.
Yeah,
I was just going to be making dinner and doing laundry and changing diapers. And that doesn't, take a lot, we think. Mm-hmm. And then, but we find out that it does, but we haven't cultivated any of that initiative to see what needs to be done and work outside someone else's checklist or
exactly.
Really it's kind of like it being an entrepreneur when you're a homemaker.
It absolutely is. I mean, it really is. And I feel like there's so much sort of poison in that when people say just a homemaker. Mm-hmm. And so many women who have given their lives to it still say just a homemaker. It's like they're doing it, but they still think of it as something that's like, well, it's too bad I never, really did anything with my life. Because that is so much the attitude. And we all have had it trained into us that if you're just a homemaker, you should be a little embarrassed of yourself. It's kind of a shame that you wasted all that opportunity that you had to go, file insurance claims or whatever. It's like, it really is funny. I mean, it's like, we have this idea that if you're sitting in a boring old cubicle all your life, well, then you've really done something. But just a homemaker, it's a shame. It's a shame she never did anything.
It reminds me of that G.K. Chesterton quote about, what is it? Like, if you've served, basically like if you serve a man at home, that's a problem. But if you serve a man at work, it's totally fine.
Doesn't he have something else about all the women who said, we will not be dictated to, and went off and became stenographers?
Yeah, totally. Oh, God bless that man.
True.
Oh.
Was that Chesterton? I don't know. Could have been Lewis. I don't know.
Oh, it totally sounds like Chesterton, though.
Yeah, it does.
Oh.
It does.
I feel like he did have a firm grasp on the glorious part of staying at home.
Yeah, it's true. And it's something I really think there are enough Christian women who are doing it that I think if they were to capture that vision, it would be absolutely transformative in our country. Like it really would. Because I feel like so much of the wreckage that we see around us was absolutely done by the women. I mean, it was just the women dismantled everything. And the women could just as easily decide to start building instead of destroying. And I think that it could be just as impactful if we would do it. And I think there are enough women, it's not like there's only 12 Christians left. So, there are a lot of Christian wives and moms in this country. And I do think that if they were to recapture this sort of vision, it just would make such a difference. One thing that I think is noticeable is, in any war, you're not going to have one side spend huge amounts of energy and time and money trying to take some target that doesn't matter, right? I mean, they're going to do that for the capital city or something. They're not going to do it for some little nothing somewhere that doesn't matter strategically. And if you think about the sheer amount of effort that has been expended on, for the last 100 years, the focused effort to take down this particular thing, the woman's role in the home and in the family, that should tell us it matters to the other side. It's been a century of focused attack, which must mean that it's a target worth taking. And so if it matters to the enemy, it should matter to us to defend it. It's not like Satan's going to spend all his time on something that doesn't matter. So anyway, I really think that we should recapture some sense of this is worth defending. And it's worth defending because it actually is a really significant thing.
Right. I remember when I was in my mid-20s and had 3 little kids staying home. At that point, my husband was working away a lot of the week. And so I was like, okay, this job is like, I'm in over my head, just had the 3rd baby. It's probably postpartum. I'm trying to get better at it and trying to find encouragement or like instruction or whatever. And all that I landed on for helping me in that moment was put out by ultra conservative, I don't know, they're not around anymore, a group of people. And so the impression that I got, or what I was being taught by some of that material that was out there, was that men have big, important work to do, and someone has to take care of the menial, unimportant things so that the men are free to go do their work. And so that's right. Why they have a wife is to take care of all the little things so they're freed up to go. So your job is to be a content homemaker doing all the little things that frees up the men. And I mean, God used that in a way because I got to the point where I was like, well, okay, I just want to do whatever God says I should do. And if that is what God says I should do, I'll do it. And so in that sense, it was a good point for me to get to in my walk with God. But on the other hand, when having gone through that point, I was, wait a second, this isn't little. And even what I'm doing in the home isn't laundry and meals only. This is a setting for ministry work here, having people over, building community. Like there's important work to be done by the women also.
Well, and I feel like it's that when you look at it with unbelieving eyes, it can look really meaningless, really, insignificant, stupid. Like, yeah, okay, the men got to go off and do important things, and we have to stay here and do silly, stupid stuff. But it's necessary.
Because someone has to.
Whatever. Yeah.
Someone has to. God created women to do that.
Right. But the thing is, it's like you could look at the same exact thing, but through the eyes of faith, you see that in God's economy, it's those two mites. It's like that actually is significant work. And, you think about when Elisha prayed that God would open his servant's eyes, and he looked out and saw all of the angels. It's like, sometimes it's just that. It's like the work might be the same, but how you see it is different. And you can decide to see it as trivial, meaningless, and something that I'm going to basically be resentful about because, I'm being asked to do something that doesn't matter. Or you could think, this is what God has asked of me because it does matter. And I'm going to give it everything I have because it is significant. And it just doesn't have it. Sometimes the task list looks exactly the same, but it's the cup of cold water. I mean, it's just, it might be a little thing, but it actually is a big thing, it turns out.
Yeah. Well, we've lost any sense of the importance of home and beauty in the culture.
Yeah.
And so, any kind of work like going into excellent cooking or flower arranging or sewing or learning these things are just presented as, crafts you do for fun to like refresh yourself.
Me time activities.
Yeah. Or little girl time retreat thing. Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, I think as women, we have a very important place for culture building. And that culture building starts at home with the way the home flows.
It does. And without women, you can't have a culture. That's the thing. I mean, because you put a bunch of men together, they can do impressive stuff in one sense, but what they can't do is build a culture. So it's
they become pirates.
Yeah, well, I mean, they can be pirates, or they could even do something, that wasn't necessarily destroying it all, but
fair enough.
What they can't do is create a culture around them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why Adam needed Eve. He can't fill the earth and subdue it by himself. But you put Eve there and you get the human race.
I was having this conversation with my teenage son a couple of days ago, and I keep the Hand That Rocks the Cradle poem up on my fridge, and he's offended by it. He's like, do you really think that you rule the world? And I was trying to think about like, why do I like that poem so much? And it dawned on me, it's because it reminds me that my power lies in being a woman and not a man.
Yeah.
And the feminist lie is that in order to be worthy, I have to be a man.
A second-rate man at that. That's the problem.
Yeah. So true. So true. Oh, yeah. How's that for a goal in life? I want to be a second-rate man.
I know.
Let's make all the men second-rate, and then
I guess I could have told him, for now I rule your world. So we're good. Well, Mystie, before we let Rebekah go, is there anything else you want to make sure we have covered?
Well, did you feel like you had your counseling session?
I do feel like I think hearing your story, Becca, about the Cordon Bleu school was super helpful for me, because I feel like there's this expectation for the kids who are not college bound to go straight into some sort of tech school job training. It's still a career path. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's still, and I kind of feel like there's that, well, you're skipping the adventure. And those are the things that were very distasteful to me. But I don't know. I think I just wasn't thinking creatively enough about the different alternatives. So I feel like that was very expanding my mind sort of thing for me.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Because I don't want it to be like, well, the alternative is to stay home and start your boring life right away. And I feel like that's kind of the message that the world sends us.
Just take a boring job while you wait for a husband to come around.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, you can get good at something and something that you're really interested in. And it might be whatever. I mean, there's a whole huge world out there.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't have, just to clarify, I don't think we would have shipped her off to London if she was 18. But
right.
Like she's got her college degree and wanted to, go get better at something.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many ways of doing it. That's not like sending them off to a foreign country, but
right.
So many opportunities. And my sister, when I think she had just graduated from college, and she just decided, this was like the year before she got married. She was like, I am going to just take this year and just get good at a bunch of random things that she just felt like, I want to know how to do that. And they were all just, I don't even remember what all it was. Like, I'm going to learn how to upholster. I'm going to learn how to do needlepoint. She found some old lady to teach her how to make lace, to do tatting. But she was just like, here I am. I've got all these opportunities. I'm going to figure some stuff out. And it was like stuff that, later I want to know how to do this. So anyway, it doesn't necessarily have to be, onto your job, whatever that is. So
I guess it's hard to get away from a very utilitarian view of life, because it's so the air that we are breathing all of the time. Yeah. And every time I think I've broken through, I find another area of my life where I'm not free yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, we do tend to, like the paycheck is that vindicating thing, which is why women can be embarrassed of all their work. They could work like crazy, but if you didn't get a paycheck, then what good is it even? Yeah. And you don't want your girls to fall into that at an early age too, where it's just sort of like, if you're not earning a check, then you're not really working, or you're not really earning your keep, or you're not really being productive if you're not getting a check from somebody. So I would think as much as you can facilitate your daughters becoming excellent at things without putting that burden on it of the check is the thing that baptizes your work.
That's a great way of putting it. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Rebekah. This was wonderful. I really appreciate your time.
Having me on.
Both of you have a wonderful afternoon.
All right.
Thanks, Brandy. Thanks, Rebekah.
Thank you.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend and then discuss it with them. This is a great way to continue the conversation. All of the books and things we mentioned today are linked in our show notes. Just go to scholésisters.com/SS114 to check it out. Don't forget to sign up for the Scholé Sistership and join us for the TechTonic seminar. Just go to scholésisters.com/join and then upgrade to become a Sophie member. In our next episode, Misty, Abby, and I have a conversation about indoctrination. Everywhere we turn, we hear people saying that we homeschoolers are going to be different. We're going to teach our kids how to think instead of teaching them what to think. What if this is actually bad thinking? What if we actually do want to teach our kids what to think? Don't miss this important discussion coming up in 3 weeks instead of 2, because we're taking a week off for Thanksgiving. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters. I think we have sound.
Oh, is it working?
It's working.
Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm so sorry. I was tried to do it on my computer. It was like, you need to update your browser or do something else. And so then I did that. And then it was like, oh no, you can't use a microphone on the computer. So then I had to download the app.
We just make it sound fancier than it really is.
Okay. I can handle that.
Goodness. Okay. But I just lost my train of thought with the Chesterton jokes.